What is going on, everybody? This is the Parallax Viewer with your host, the Big Signorelli, aka the Big Sig. And today I'm doing something really special with my boy, Christopher Putnam. As you may know, we did an exegesis on Love and Death, the Love and Death text, specifically Todd McGowan's essay called psychoanalysis and existentialism, or after finitude, I believe, or psychoanalysis and existentialism after finitude, if I'm not mistaken, which was really fun. And we decided to do a new text. Some of you may know, if you know and follow Daniel Tutt's work, that he's doing a study group on Fredric Jameson's The Political Unconscious. So we decided to do our own line by line reading and exegetical discussion on this. So really excited. This text is very dense and very difficult if you, one, are not as familiar with Marxism and specifically Lukács and Althusser, but also if you are not also well versed in some of the literary criticisms and literature authors that he references, like Balzac, Stendhal, etc. So I think that was the only difficult part. But other than that, this text is just really, really elaborate on not only philosophical themes but psychoanalysis, political Marxism, ideology critique, semiotics, and literature. So, yeah, man. Chris, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I was reading a little bit of it in Starbucks until these like two teenage girls were fighting to each other to get in the bathroom. I wanted to recommend the book to them and be like, "You girls like romance books," but I didn't want to get kicked out.
That's hilarious.
What
All
about
right.
you?
Yeah. So, I mean, whenever we can begin, I could read
Okay.
like the first two pages.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah. So the preface right here, he starts off with his famous slogan, always historicize, which we're going to get into like what he specifically means by that term. This slogan, the one absolute, and we may even say transhistorical imperative of all dialectical thought, will unsurprisingly turn out to be the moral of the political unconscious as well. But as the traditional dialectic teaches us, the historicizing operation can follow two distinct paths, which only ultimately meet in the same place: the path of the object and the path of the subject. The historical origins of the things themselves, and that more intangible, tangible historicity of the concept and categories by which we attempt to understand those things. In the area of culture, which is the central field of the present book, we are thus confronted with a choice between study of the nature of the objective structures of a given cultural text, the historicity of its forms and of its content, the historical moment of emergence of its linguistic possibilities, the situation specific function of its aesthetics, and something rather different, which would instead foreground the interpretive categories or codes through which we read and receive the text in question. For better or for worse, it is the second path we have chosen to follow. The political follow here. The political unconscious accordingly turns on the dynamics of the act of interpretation and presupposes its original organizational fiction, that we can never really confront a text immediately in all its freshness as a thing in itself. Rather, the text comes before us as the always already read, apprehended them through sedimented layers of previous interpretations, or if the text is brand new, through the sediment reading habits and categories developed by those inherited interpretive traditions. This presupposition then dictates the use of a method, which I have elsewhere termed meta-commentary, according to which our object of study is less the text itself than the interpretations through which we attempt to confront and to appropriate it. Interpretation is here construed as an essential allegorical act, which consists in rewriting a given text in terms of a particular interpretive master code. The identification of the latter will lead to an evaluation of such codes, or in other words, of the methods or approaches current in American literary and cultural studies today. Their juxtaposition with dialectical and totalizing properly Marxist ideal of understanding will be used to demonstrate the structural limitations of the other interpretive codes, and in particular to show that the local ways in which they construct their object of study and the strange strategies of containment whereby they are able to project the illusion that their readings are somehow complete and self-sufficient. So I'll keep reading right now, but I want to kind of pause because he's saying a lot. And so, like,
Mm-hmm.
he lists two different dialectical methods, right? But the one that we're kind of going to focus on is the movement of these sort of linguistic codes and signifiers through the literary text, which is a cultural product, not on its own, but within relationship to the social relations. We can think of it as, in the Althusserian sense, you have the base and then the superstructure. The base being the mode of production, the material processes of the productive forces, and the relationships of production, which is a fancy way of saying that the material base is a set of relations that are able to, produce a system uh, economically, but also just materially for the human relations. Capitalism is the dominant base today, as it was in the time of Althusser and even in the time of Marx. And then the superstructure is going to be the strata of the social relations and the reproduction of those relations from the base to sustain the base as well. And that's going to be, the class composition, the class struggle, but also institutions like church, army, state, and specifically the state as the sort of, in the Leninist sense, the manifestation of irreconcilable class contradictions, class struggles. And this is also where ideology emerges from to be able to maintain reproduction. Now, for Althusser, he's more focused on like the concrete aspect of the way the ideology operates in sort of like the state apparatuses like church, state, or church, schools, media institutions, and newspapers, and all sorts of other media, um, and even the university, in Lacan's sense, the university discourse. For Fredric Jameson, it seems as if though like we're going to see the ideological relations and the mystifications through interpretation of texts and the way that commentary, reading, and interpretations have kind of diverged from something like a Marxism or a sort of like singularity. A lot of the polemics that he's talking about, that he's like up against, are going to be like those of French post-structuralism, specifically like D&G, Lyotard, and the sort of Nietzschean sense of no meaning interpretation. It's like a multiplicity of different codes without a singular meaning. And so he's dialectizing, using the method of interpretation to get at all these different commentaries, these different stratas, by also historicizing, by retroactively going back. Okay. With that being said, we can get back into it. I'll read the last few paragraphs right here. The retrospective illusion of the meta commentary thus has the advantage of allowing us to measure the yield and density of the properly Marxist interpretive act against those other interpretive methods: the ethical, the psychoanalytic, the mythical critical, the semiotic, the structural, and the theological, against which it must compete in the pluralism of the intellectual marketplace today. I will argue here the priority of a Marxian interpretive framework in terms of semantic richness. Marxism cannot today be defended as a mere substitute for such other methods, which would then triumphantly be consigned to the ash can of history. The authority of such methods springs from their faithful consonance with this or the local law of fragmented social life. This or that subsystem of complex and mushrooming cultural superstructure. In the spirit of a more authentic dialectical tradition, Marxism is here conceived as the ultra transcendable horizon or untranscendable horizon that could subsume such apparently antagonistic or incomprehensible critical operations, assigning them an undoubted sectoral validity within itself. and thus at once canceling and preserving them. Sublation. Because of the peculiar focus of the retrospective organization, however, it will be worth warning the reader that what the political unconscious is not. The reader should not, in the first place, expect anything like an extraordinary projection of what a vital and emergent political culture should be or do, which Raymond Williams has rightly proposed as the most urgent task of a Marxist cultural criticism. There are, of course, good and objective historical reasons why contemporary Marxism has been slow in rising to this challenge. The sorry history of Zanovi prescription in the arts is one in the of the fascinations with modernism, and revolutions in form and language is another, as well as coming of the whole new political and economic world system to which the oldest or the older Marxist cultural paradigm only perfectly apply. So right here, like, and kind of like piggyback off what he's saying, like, you know, when he says that, it's not just Marxism as an interpretation for these cultural texts and methods, is not just one of many to which it is sort of relativized to other interpretations, which you see in, like, not only Anglo-American academia, but also this arises from culture critique and theory in post-structuralist and even postmodern, especially in aesthetics. And with that being said, like, that's why it shouldn't be just uh dumped into the trash bin of history, because it's still important for understanding contradictions and antagonisms ideologically and materially that other methods cannot hold. And so, with that being said, even the text too holds within it something that cancels out and preserves this dialectical Hegelian sublation. And um, because of that, Marxism is able to create a sort of unity through the multiplicity of things that are not just flowing, but are actually in tension when it comes to the interpretations. We'll see more what that means, but we can think of it as like the certain semantic ideological terms or the perspectives of the author and even of the reader. And again, his silent critics are going to be like those that are influenced by the post-structuralist, postmodernist camp, and those that are categorized within them. Again, Derrida, Foucault, but mainly like Deleuze, Guattari, and Lyotard are like the main culprits. And then like the sort of left Nietzscheanism of aesthetics as well. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Chris.
I was just gonna say that when I first started reading the preface, I was on my way to Koreatown. I wasn't, but I was reading it and I had no fucking clue what was up, what was down, left or right. And then now that like I'm 140 pages in, I can see he's doing everything he says he's going to do in the preface. So I know Daniel Tutt was saying this. I was talking to Nensky about it too. We were talking about how for philosophy, usually the preface is the hardest part of the book, like being in time, technology of spirit, that God is Undead book, the introduction that Lorenzio Chisio was doing. I don't know what the hell was going on. And it's just kind of fun to revisit now because with like everything you just went over and then what Daniel, Conrad, and getting into, because I'm not extremely well versed in Marxism. This is I kind of bit off a little more than I chew with this group. That's why I keep posting like the memes of like the eagle dropping the like soared it to new heights, the deer, then dropping it to its death, and that's kind of how I feel. But I think it's good text. I think it's good. I just want to praise more the method of reading something you're not completely familiar with. Because it's like when
Oh,
I first started reading
no, I was just saying, I
Heidegger,
was agreeing with you. Yeah, I was like, yeah.
and I was just gonna say, like, when I first started reading Heidegger, I don't know what the hell he was talking about, or what being for itself is, or Dasein and those terms. And it's like there's a little bit more guides with Heidegger, I want to say, so that's why I think groups like this are important. And just to fucking at some point just say fuck it like, and just read it and see what happens, see what clicks with you. Because there's some parts of the book that I feel a little bit more comfortable with now. And James is a very, I was talking to ChatGPT about it, which is a horrible idea. But I was talking about how Heidegger is more like circular, and he's saying it was saying that Jameson is a little bit more like elliptical, and then he's kind of like circling around, and he's having conversations with his critics. He's having conversations with works of literature that you may not be familiar with, and he's trying to almost like immerse you in what the political subconscious is. And that's why in the beginning here, he's like telling you what he's not going to do and exactly what he's going to do. So I think it's good shit. But with that, unless you have anything else to add, I'll just keep reading.
Well, yeah, I'll only add one thing. I think like yeah, like he's like very elliptical, but at the same time, like he immerses you in the method and in the reading, and you have to like kind of really track like the different interlocutors and the different references, and he's trying to piece together and build up his argument. And it's like to understand what the Marxist interpretation is also understand what Jameson himself is doing, and he's kind of building up a sort of totalizing position, if you could say, through the process of the dialectic. And like going back to repeating what I said earlier, it's like, it's interesting to see how like that interpretive framework of Marxism gets thrown to the ash can of history as just like, oh, it's another interpretive method among many. But we're not going to use that one as much. We're going to worry about, critiquing the author based upon their gender, race, class, or like whatever the product of their culture. Freud, oh, he's just like this because he's just a cis male white European in Germany, so he's got a bunch of biases, or like maybe this is like an author wrote like this because he was going through his psychosis, so we could trace it to some sort of psychologism. I mean, that's just like one of the naive ones. But then you got other sort of frameworks where it's like it's deconstruction, where you see the binary opposition of signifiers and trying to look at like the difference or supplementary of the text. There's nothing outside the text, as like Derrida would say. But I don't think Jameson is doing that. But to my last point, it's like you kind of see this with Marxism too. Let me know if you've experienced this, because I know you're taking sociology. But like sometimes you will learn about Marx in sociology, but you will only learn him like as just one figure among many figures. And he talked about
Put him
economic
in a
determinism.
box.
Yeah, they put him in like a box relative to other ones, but then they don't even privilege his method. He kind of just like do it as a way to sort of devalue or delegitimize Marx's method, however they interpret that method to be, and just think it's a set of ideas. And he thought that uh, the world was structured by classes, and that one dominated
Conflict theory is what
yeah,
they put.
conflict theory.
They put him in. They put Durkheim in the functionalist box, and that's not even right. They just
Right,
turn them into like little Mickey Mouse figures that they can copy and
exactly.
paste, like
Yeah,
you're saying. So it fits whatever narratives they want. And it's funny because it's like Jameson is kind of talking about how that happens, and not to like you can historicize without doing like psychologists and other things like that, is what I feel like you're kind of saying, to where it's you need to know the time. And I just picked up, I ordered it. Pierre Bourdieu has a book on Heidegger's politics, and he's like situating it in the habitus. I didn't read it yet, but I was looking up arguments about it, and I think his main argument is kind of like Heidegger was a product of his time based on like the habitus he found himself in. And it doesn't excuse everything he did, but at the same time, you need to understand. It's like 50 years from what's going on with Israel and Palestine, for people to have a completely different narrative and be like, well, you need to understand what the climate was and other stuff. So it's like people already kind of historicize without realizing it. But I feel like Jameson's arguing to do the more Marxist element of it. And like later on in the book, when he's talking about Levi Strauss, talking about his it's kind of like Baudrillard, where he's talking about how it's like binary opposition, and it's like Jameson's even trying to like put that in the unconscious and like trying to say like it's still a product of whatever is going on in that current like paradigm. So I like what you're saying about the dialect, how it's
Yeah,
in
yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, and it's like presently looking back at the past that to inform our present, not to be like, oh, if we look at the past, then this will tell us like where we're going, like in this sort of naive progressive sense, more like a sort of contradictory way where it's like, I know I remember like in the Althusser group, Conrad was saying like, the way that like Fredric Jameson historicizes is like, the way that we look at texts from the past. Or like even the way like movies that try to depict ancient Rome or Egypt and Greece is really just like not a reflection of like our knowledge of the past, but really like our attitude and ideological structure presently. Because it's like these like movies about like whether it's ancient Rome or like Egypt, and it's like everybody's like white looking and
Yeah,
they got like sort of like cheap corny like British type accents that don't even
100%.
fit everything, so it's just like and everything especially like in different
Charlton Heston, I'm thinking of.
yeah and so it's
Not
like
to talk shit about Charlton Heston, he's wonderful.
yeah, but that would be like an example really like the way that we project like into the past, really like also the sort of ideological kernels of like our present epoch as well. So like this importance of a dialectically interpretation is a great way to really kind of detether from whatever kernel. And to be more specific, like he's going to talk about like all the different types of like literature, like romanticism, realism. But like when we look at like past literature, not to like elevate it to like this sort of like status that it's like holds some like the truth that's about something, like it'll stand the test of time. That's not sort of antiquarian, not having this antiquarian interpretation of it, of reading past text to sort of get some truth about it. So yeah.
I'm sure we could say a lot too. I'll just say the one last thing I want to say, which I've already said before, is for how dense Jameson is and difficult, if you don't have like a group or like some type of exegesis or not secondary source, but just like an other to sort of work through this with, you're gonna be lost in the sauce and not believe even like third of what you're putting out right now. Because when I was reading this, the first like couple times I had no clue. It's just helpful. So I just think what we're doing is good. That's just my little sales pitch for doing this type of stuff or doing a reading group, because these texts are really hard, but they're like my sociology professor when he had us start with the allegory of the cave, and everybody seemed really confused. And he was like, he got them to be like, "Yeah, I want to get out of the cave." So he's like, "All right, so when you're reading these texts throughout the semester, they're hard and they're dense, but they're rewarding." And he's like, "You could keep reading these things." And he's anti like Disneyfying, Mickey Mousing like the authors of Marxism. I think that's important. Furthermore, a provisional conclusion to the present work will spell out some of the challenge Marxist interpretation must anticipate in conceiving those new forms of collective thinking and collective culture, which lie beyond the boundaries of our work. The reader will there find an empty chair reserved for some as yet unrealized collective and decentered cultural production of the future, beyond realism and modernism alike. Oh, one other last thing I just wanted to say. I watched some of that panel where they like, had Jameson on at the end. I was listening to that before, and
I need to watch.
they were saying they it was funny because when you're talking about totalizing, they mentioned it's really good. That's just dense too, but I recommend it. And one of the speakers in it was just saying the problem with this text is it makes you want to read other things. Like you were telling me, I'd want to read Althusser, and that's why I ordered some, and that's why I want to read more Lukács, which I have, just to be in better dialogue conversation that's going on. And that part too reminds me of being in time, because Somebody was talking to me about being in nothingness, and I think I told you this last week. How this guy at the bar was like, "Oh no, read Camus first," and I was like, "No, you're probably better off reading Heidegger or Husserl to understand what Sartre's trying to do." And it's like this book is similar, just with like Marxism and the literary text. So that's all.
Yeah, yeah, or like reading them alongside, but like definitely like when it comes to like being and nothingness, you don't want to read Camus first because
No,
you're not gonna learn anything about Sartre through Camus. Totally different people. It's like one's a novelist and playwright, but also like a sort of like literary aesthetic, whereas like Sartre is a philosopher first, even though he did novels and plays. It's like he's got philosophical concepts, like he has an ontology and an ethics
100%.
and a politics.
Yes, cross eyes. I'm just kidding. That's what you look like if you try to read Camus at the same time. If this book then fails to propose a political or revolutionary aesthetic, it is equally little concerned to raise once again the traditional issues of philosophical aesthetic, the nature and function of art, the specificity of poetic language, and of the aesthetic experience, the theory of the beautiful, and so forth. Yet the very absence of such issues may serve as implicit commentary on them. I have tried to maintain an essentially historicist perspective in which our readings of the past are virtually dependent on our experiences of the present, and in particular on the structural peculiarities of what is sometimes called the Society di Consubstantia. Apologies for my French, I barely passed that class. Or the discommune, the moment of late monopoly or consumer or multinational capitalism, what Guy Debord calls the society of the image or of the spectacle. The point is that in such a society, saturated with messages and with aesthetic experiences of all kinds, the issues of an older philosophical aesthetics themselves need to be radically historicized and can be expected to be transformed beyond recognition in the process. Nor, although literary history is here everywhere implied, should the political unconscious be taken as paradigmatic work in this discursive form or genre, which is today in crisis. Traditional literary history was a subset of representative narrative, the kind of narrative realism become as problematic as it is principal exemplars in the history of the novel. The second chapter of the present book, which is concerned with genre criticism, will raise the theoretical problems of the status and possibilities of such literary historical narratives, which in Marxism and form I term diachronic construct. The subsequent readings of Balzac, Gissing, and Conrad, not Conrad Hamilton, project the diachronic framework, the construction of the bourgeois subject in emergent capitalism, and its schizophrenic disinterrogation of our own time, which is, however, here never fully worked out. Of literary history today, we may observe that its past is at one with that proposed by Louis Althusser for historiography in general. Not to elaborate some achieved and lifelike simulacrum of its supposed object, but rather to produce the later concept. This is indeed what the greatest modern or modernizing literary histories, such as Eric Auerbach's Babesis, have sought to do in their critical practice, if not in their theory. Is it at least possible, then, that the present work might be taken as an outline or projection of a new kind of critical method? Indeed, it would seem to me perfectly appropriate to recast many of its findings in the form of a methodological handbook, but such a manual would have as its object ideological analysis, which remains, I believe, the appropriate designation for the critical method specific to Marxism. For reasons indicated above, this book is not that manual, which would necessarily settle its accounts with rival methods in a far more polemic spirit. Yet the unavoidably Hegelian tone of the retrospective framework of the political unconscious should not be taken to imply that such polemic interventions are not of the highest priority for Marxist cultural criticism. On the contrary, the latter must necessarily also be what Althusser has demanded of the practice of Marxist philosophy proper, namely, past struggle within theory. For the non-Marxist reader, like Christopher, however, who may feel that this book is quite polemic enough, I will add what should be unnecessarily and underline my debt to the greatest pioneers of narrative. My theoretical dialogue with them in these pages is not merely to be taken as yet another specimen in the negative critique of false confidence, although it is that too, and indeed in the conclusion I will deal explicitly with the problem of proper uses of such critical gestures as demystification and ideological unmasking. It should meanwhile be obvious that no work in the area of narrative analysis can afford to ignore the fundamental contributions of Northrop Frye, the codifications by A.G. Grimius of the whole formalist and semiotic traditions. You'll see those names a lot. The heritage of the certain Christian hermeneutics, and above all, the indispensable explorations by Freud of the logic of dreams, by Claude Levi-Strauss, of the logic of primitive storytelling and pensée savante, not to speak of the flawed yet monumental achievements in this area of the greatest Marxist philosopher of modern times, George Lukács. These divergent and unequal bodies of work are here interrogated and evaluated from the perspective of the specific critical and interpretive tasks of the present time, namely to restructure the problematics of ideology of the unconscious and of desire of representation of history and of cultural production around the all-informing process of narrative, which I take to be here, using the shorthand of philosophical idealism, the central function or instance of human mind. This perspective may be reformulated in terms of the traditional dialectical code as the study of Darth law, that untranslatable designation in which the current problems of representation productively insert what the quite different ones of presentation or the essentially narrative and rhetorical movement of language.
Yeah, that was a really dense one, but I think like a couple things like, and it goes back to what he concluded with what you read on the importance of Darstellung, which is a German term. I mean I think that the the definition that he's designating Darstellung as like the untranslatable designation, uh and like something of the problems of that representation cannot show. It's dealing with more with like the sort of an interpretive concept, or it's tied in with narrative, and narrative for him is going to be what is tied in with the political unconscious. It's not tied in with representation or Vorstellung, this image. I think this is exactly what, going back to what you read when he mentioned Guy Debord and the transformation of capitalism, to where we're oversaturated with not only consumer goods but images that display that, and these images are not only Vorstellung, but they're also, ideologically saturated, because it goes back to something that like Althusser says in his ideology text, which I think you just got right, where he
Yep.
says like ideology is both like our imaginary representation and configuration to the social and reality, but also it has no history. And so I think like for this to be able to historicize is also to trace back a sort of narrative, and he's using different things. We've said ad nauseum, it's dialectical. It's going through the contradictions and retroactively, and then also he evoked AJ Graymoss, who is a semiotician, and in which you look at different codes. Like he has what's called the Grama square, and we'll definitely go on that later on. But just to kind of give a sort of like tease, it has to do with certain codes or signifiers or semantic phrases that are sort of juxtaposed by a contrary. So like in for example, Levi Strauss, Levi Strauss talks about different like mythic codes and combinations, but like for Gray Moss, applying it Levi Strauss onto Gray Moss, like the two different contraries would be culture versus nature, and you could create a Gray Moss square of the way a society views certain things on the level of nature versus on the level of culture, and these things have with in the codes embedded contradictions. So you map out these two contraries and the contradictions on the square to get a sort of map of how these codes operate structurally within each other. And for Jameson, he will dialecticize that aspect of the square, because it's not just one square, it's multiple squares. You got a cultural square, you got an economic square, an ideological one, you could say. And so using that method with the dialectic, he's able to get at this idea of underlying designation, the Darstellung. And I think it's interesting to think about, like, this idea of like the saturation of the image, like in the spectacle of Guy Debord. Because like if you think about this in relationship with the fact that ideology has no history, like um the way in which like certain codes, signifiers can take on something where it's like uh it has no diachrony, it has no movement in time. It purely just changes its meaning, not in a historical sense, but just like in a sort of presentist way. Um, and like the example I'm thinking of, and I don't know who used the term flotation signifier, or the floating signifier, if it was Jameson first or if it was Baudrillard. I think Baudrillard uses it in the freaking the symbolic exchange in death text, but also recall it, I believe, being used in the one of Jameson's other famous texts, which is postmodernism, the cultural logic of capitalism. And I mean, like the example that like I'm thinking of is like look at like Disney, look at like the Disney characters like Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck. Those are examples of like flotation signifiers, because what do they represent? Like they have no history. Like the characters themselves have no history. Like uh they have no like developmental character process that take on signification. They mean whatever they want to mean. They're just there. But when you actually look back at like the origin of those characters, though, not only were they just there, but they were actually taking on a lot of American ideological shit, like how much racist stuff that like Donald Duck was saying, like the damn Japanese, the damn Japs, like when he's like in World War II, or like some other racist stuff that Mickey Mouse is whistling while he's steering the boat. So
Steamboat
like,
Willie, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
That
So
was my ex girlfriend's Skype profile picture, which I thought she's Guyanese too, so I thought it was hilarious. She never understood like why I thought it was funny, and I was
that's hilarious.
like, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just the
No, no,
second
that
you
was
said
actually
that, I
no,
was like,
yeah, yeah, no, that was really all I had to really say. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
no, I liked everything you said. I figure I'll finish off the preface if you want, and then I'm gonna
Okay,
take
I'll just, yeah,
a head break real quick after
yeah.
that. But let's just finish. Last but not least, the reader may well be puzzled as to why a book ostensibly concerned with interpretive act should devote so little attention to issues of interpretive validity and to the criteria by which a given interpretation may be faulted or accredited. I happen to feel that no interpretation can be effectively disqualified on its own terms by a simple enumeration of inaccuracies or omissions, or by a list of unanswered questions. Interpretations Interpretation is not an isolated act, but takes place within a Homeric battlefield, on which a host of interpretive options are either openly or implicitly in conflict. If the positivistic conception of teleological accuracy be the only alternative, then I would much prefer to endorse the current provocative celebration of strong misreadings over a weak one. As the Chinese proverb has it, you use one axe handle to cue another. In our context, only another stronger interpretation can overthrow and practically refute an interpretive already in place. I would therefore be content to have the theoretical sections of this book judged and tested against interpretive practice. This very antithesis marks out the double standard and the formal dilemma of all cultural study today, from which the political unconscious is scarcely exempt, an uneasy struggle for priority between models and history, between theoretical speculation and textual analysis, in which the former seeks to transform the latter into so many mere examples adduced to support its abstract propositions, while the latter continues insistently to imply that the theory itself is just so much methodological scaffolding which can readily be dismantled once the serious business of practical criticism is underway. These two tendencies, theory and literary history, have so often in Western academia been felt to be rigorously incompatible that it is worth reminding the reader in conclusion of the existence of a third position which transcends both. That position is, of course, Marxism, which in the form of the dialectic affirms the primacy of theory, which is at once and the same time a recognition of the primacy of theory. Fredric Jameson, Killingworth, Connecticut. The I don't know if you want to pause it or if you want to whack
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. We could pause it real quick. And now we're about to start the first chapter. Our shit's about to get real. About to learn about literature as a socially symbolic act. And so this aspect is on the method of interpretation. So Fredric Jameson says this book will argue the priority of political interpretation of a literary text. It conceives the political perspective not as some supplementary method, not as an optional auxiliary to other interpretive methods current today, the psychoanalytic or the mythical critical, the stylistic, the ethical, the structural, but rather as an absolute horizon of all reading and all interpretation. This is evidently a much more extreme position than the modest claim, surely acceptable to everyone, that certain texts have social and historical, sometimes even political resonances. Traditional literary history has, of course, never prohibited the investigation of such topics as the Florentine political background in Dante, Milton's relationship to the schismatics, or Irish historical allusions in Joyce. I would argue, however, that such information, even where it is not recontained, recontained as it is in most instances by an idealistic conception of the history of ideas, does not yield an interpretation as such, but rather as at best its indispensable precondition. Today, this properly antiquarian relationship to the past, to the cultural past, has a dialectical counterpart, which is ultimately no more satisfactory. I mean, the tendency of much contemporary theory to rewrite selected texts from the past in terms of its own aesthetic, and in particular in terms of a modernist or more properly postmodernist conception of language. I have shown elsewhere the way in which such ideologies of the text construct a straw man, or in essential term variously called the readerly or the realistic or referential text, over against which the essential term writerly or modernist or open text, creature, or textual productivity is defined, and with which it is seen as a decisive break. But Croke's great dictum that all history is contemporary history does not mean that all history is our contemporary history. And the problems begin with your when your epistemological break begins to displace itself in times according to your own current interests, so that Balzac may stand for unenlightened representationality when you are concerned to bring out everything that is textual and modern in Flaubert, but turns into something else when with Roland Barthes in SNZ, you have decided to rewrite Balzac as Philip Solers as sheer text and écriture. This unacceptable option or ideological double bind between antiquarianism and modernizing relevance or projection demonstrates that the old dilemmas of historicism, in particular the question of the claims of monuments from distance and even archaic moments of cultural past on a cultural different present, do not go away just because we chose to ignore them. Our presupposition in the analysis that follows will be that only a genuine philosophy of history is capable of respecting the specificity and radical difference of the social and cultural past, while disclosing the solidarity of its polemics and passions, its forms, structures, experiences, and struggles with those of the present day. But genuine philosophers of history have never been numerous, and few survive in a workable, usable form in the contemporary world of consumer capitalism and the multinational system. We will have enough occasion in the pages that follow to emphasize the methodological interests of Christian historicism and the theological origins of the first great hermeneutic systems in Western tradition. To be permitted the additional observation that the Christian philosophy of history, which emerged full blown in Augustine's City of God, can no longer be partly binding on us. As for the philosophy of history of the heroic bourgeoisie, its two principal variants, the vision of progress that um, the vision of progress that emerges from the ideological struggles of French Enlightenment and the organic populism or nationalism, which articulated the rather different historicity of Central and Eastern European people, and which is generally associated with the name of herder, are neither of extinct certainly, but are at the very least both discredited under the hegemonic embodiments of positivism and classical liberalism, and in nationalism, respectively. So I think this is like really interesting because it's like again, when it comes to like these texts and interpretations, it's like what he said in the beginning of the first page that I read of this chapter. It's like kind of putting the horizon of history of all these different texts into one sort of narrative. Um, and again, these two things that I mentioned about the antiquarian interpretation and the modernist perspective, and or as he says, the postmodernists. And I mean, from what I've never read Roland Barthes really, but I know Roland Barthes is like the death of the author dude, where he's just like, there is no author, we just have a series of
He the
different like
camera
text.
guy too, because I know
uh
Han talks about him a lot. Where he talks
I
about like the dictum and the like whatever.
think I'm not sure. I know he does talk about the image and film, but I'm not sure if it's the camera guy.
It's
um
like camera obscura or something.
oh yeah, I know
Sorry, I
you're
didn't
talking.
mean to throw you off.
No, I know what you're talking about, but I don't know who actually invented that camera obscurum.
Yeah,
uh
camera lucidia. He's like
okay.
big on that too, but I'm probably taking it down a different wavelength.
Hmm. No, it's Roland Barthes is like a literary critic
Yeah,
From France, but like he's also like considered to be a part of the structuralist camp in semiotics, but like semiotics,
mythology, the
yeah,
death of the author, image being
yeah,
text.
yeah. And so like you just have different like works that sort of like put into question if there's something like a over I know like over like the regime of the one that comes more from Foucault, but in the sense like deprivileging the status of the author and only just like the sort of a series of texts, networks of texts within texts. And then like right here when he mentions like the hermeneutics of the early Christian writers, specifically Augustine. I think this is where like he's going to start to get into like this idea of what he calls expressive causality, right? And if I understand correctly from the sort of Christian writers, this expressive causality and hermeneutic interpretations of the Bible, or like of certain ideas within the text or canon, is supposed to like trace back its like sort of legit meaning that are expressed and caused by the word of God, right? I mean, hermeneutics originally, because I know Heidegger uses the term hermeneutics, and you get like this sort of philosophy of hermeneutics to like Paul Ricoeur and what's his name, Gadamer, but it originally comes from Christian scholarships.
That's where Heidegger got it from too, because he was
Yeah,
studying.
yeah, because he was trying to be a theologian, right? Yeah,
Yeah, and he
yeah,
saw Hannah Arendt, and he was like,
yeah.
just kidding. Kind of.
It
Kidding
all
about
happened.
it.
Yeah, it all happened relatively around the same time.
But let me do some textual analysis of that. He actually sent her a letter. I was
That's
like,
funny.
"Yo, you're an amazing." What do you think about totalitarianism? But that's fine. I'm gonna get your check canceled.
That's hilarious. All
Like
right.
Jameson, my like goes in like 37 different directions. But that's what I was saying before though. Like what those speakers were saying, the amount of referencing Jameson gives you just makes you want to become like an
Right.
expert on
Yeah, no, for real.
philosophy or whatever. Like
Yeah.
Bourdieu's the same way. I'm looking at like the references and reading Habitus and Field and reading this at the same time is insane because they both are talking about Levi Strauss. They're both talking about Lukács, Althusser, Saussure, and they're all kind of in dialogue. And I don't know enough about Jameson, and I don't want to like put him in a box, but I feel like the concept of habitus, field of political unconscious, sort of go together in a sense because it's all about orienting oneself to the historicity, the milieu you're in. Where Jameson though is arguing more so where not to bring back Todd's clip, but like where he was saying like Jameson the Marxist utopia, not about the death part, but just he's more like, hey, let's use a Marxist aspect for this because it's useful for furthering the cause, leading to practice. That's what I feel like he's
Yeah,
doing, but he's just doing it with the literary analysis of
yeah, and
show.
yeah, yeah. I will say though, like in terms of like him in Bordeaux, like the habitus is more of like the cultural climate which creates the class, whereas like for Jameson, who adheres to a more Marxist materialism, it's the material conditions and forces that generate the social relations, and from those social relations we get social consciousness, and part of the social consciousness would be um the what I listed earlier when talking about Althusser, but we could see right here he's focusing on the social consciousness which would produce the text. So in a sense, like if there is a similarity to habitus, the habitus would only be the social consciousness part, but not the social relations. And the social relations are class prior. It's the class relations which are social, not necessarily economical. That's sort of like the straw man interpretation of class theory. Um, is that it generates and reproduces the social relations and the social consciousness.
Yeah, or do more like from what I'm gathering, and I also have to realize that it's a lectures he's doing, and it's not the same as like Heidegger's lecture courses. It's just like Bourdieu speaking in front of a bunch of young sociologists, and even he is like, "Hey, I'm kind of like doing a straw man here of like these guys in my own account." But I think a lot of the criticism he gets too is because he's kind of like just trying to subsume everything into his like grand theory in a sense. It can almost become deterministic because like he
Yeah,
puts the church as like the habitus, as like the living church today, and the field is like what makes up Catholicism and Christianity.
yeah.
You do
Well, I
that with
heard.
like,
Sorry, no, no. I'll let you
no,
finish.
you're fine. No, no,
I was gonna say I heard he does have like a really good text though, like criticizing like the academic, like
yeah,
sort of like ideology of the academic in the
yeah, I
universe.
want to read that too.
Yeah, but I know like for the most part, like he was also very critical of Marxism. Yeah, so
Yeah,
like
that's what I'm getting from like this kind of. I was talking to that Adam Bennett guy, that's his channel name, who was in the vegan concourse for a little bit, and he was saying I forget the woman's name, but it was like some other author who was, wrote a, like a critique against distinction, which is a famous Bourdieu text. So he kind of, I sent him a clip, or not a clip, but like some photos from some paragraphs I thought were, sorry, that was long winded, and blame continental philosophy for that. He was telling me he feels like Bourdieu is trying to do almost like the Hegelian like critique on a hill and subsuming stuff. But it's weird because in the chapter he also is like, I don't want to do that, but he kind of is. Where I agree with you that Jameson is more like yes and no, but you can still orient yourself to that like class consciousness and make changes and other things that it kind of breaks from the more like not nihilism, but just more like deterministic. Like, oh, that's
right,
just my habitus or disposition, and I have a weak disposition, and that's why I'm doing this
right, yeah,
silly
because
stuff.
it's not like they're like fixed, right? You
Yeah,
know.
yeah. I'm still reading it. I'm only like 100 pages in, so if anybody's a Bourdieu scholar watching this, whatever, I fucking I got a D in my fucking logic class, which I took it the first time. So I think that would. I would go on like walks because I hated some formal logic. But anyway, I don't want to digress too much. Do you have anything else you want to add about what we just read or said?
No, 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 not at all.
My position here is that only Marxism, and that's such a cop out of mine too, to just be like, oh, I'm just stupid, so whatever. But it's whatever. I want to defer to that. My position here, it's like when you're giving your buddy legal advice, like in the
It's like,
Navy, or one buddy
yeah,
was going to mass, and we're like, hey, at the end of the day, though, like, I'm not a lawyer,
I'm
so
not a lawyer though.
yeah, good
Don't
luck.
don't take my word for it though.
Exactly. Just so you absolve yourself. My position here is that it's my habit is that only Marxism offers a philosophically coherent and ideologically compelling resolution to the dilemma of historicism. And that literally answers our question right there. So we just only Marxism can give us an adequate account of the essential mystery of the cultural past, which, like Tiresias drinking the blood, is momentarily returned to life and warmth and allowed once more to speak and to deliver its long forgotten message in surrounding utterly alien to in surrounding utterly alien. This mystery can be reenacted only if the human adventure is one, only thus, and not through the hobbies of antiquarianism or the projections of the mind. Can we glimpse the vital claims upon us of such long dead issues as the seasonal alternative of the economy of primitive tribes? The passionate disputes about the nature of the Trinity, the conflicting models of the polis, or the universal empire, are apparently closer to us in the dusty parliamentary and journalistic polemics of the 19th century nations. These matters can recover their original urgency for us only if they are retold with the unity of a single great collective story. Only if, in however disguised and symbolic a form, they are seen as sharing a single fundamental theme. For Marxism, the collective struggle to wrest a realm of freedom from a realm of necessity. Only if they are grasped as vital episodes in a single vast, unfinished plot. The history of all hereto, words are hard, existing society is the history of class struggle. Free man and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, and a wood oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in common ruin of the contending classes. It is in detecting the traces of that uninterrupted narrative in restoring to the surface of the text the repressed and buried reality of this fundamental history that the doctrine of the political unconscious finds its function and its necessity. One thing I want to add is some of Jameson reminds me of continental philosophy because he'll use his term first, like in the preface, political unconscious, and then throughout the work kind of define. It's not like the
Yeah, yeah, and
analytical like axiom one.
mhm. Yeah, we don't define the terms first and then go, but it's like over time we define them and see how they operate. It's very dialectical. It's almost like the sort of you don't start well. There's always that critique of like Hegel's propositionless, but like you start off with yeah, like the term and you put it in motion and describe it, but then over time we see how it defines itself over time, and that's exactly how we're doing with what he'll get into with the semiotics. And like, of course, I want you to keep reading, but it's like right here when he says the thing that you read. My position here is that only Marxism offers a philosophically coherent and ideological compelling resolution to the dilemma of historicism evoked. Only Marxism can give us an adequate account of the essential mystery of the cultural past. Um, and so like it makes me think of like what like he even brings down history to is all history is hitherto the history of class struggles, but it's like we don't start off with in Marx's theory is like, oh, it's class struggle, then we go down. It's like we realize right now that we have existing struggles, but then when we go back to the past we need to see like how you know this informs us to where we get now to realize the developments for this existing antagonism, the genesis of an antagonism, like tracing the cell to realize how the fuck did I get fucking leukemia, right? Or like bronchitis, like the sort of diagnosis, legit a diagnosis, by excavating the cultural past, by seeing this movement, development,
It
transformation.
it seems like he's doing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, like his own ontology of the political unconscious, where it's showing in these different like literary periods how it's changing and manifesting, and that's why it's sort of like evolving into that Marxist like, slash struggle, class consciousness, like that we need to like the end aim is that like seize the means of production, get fucking kumbaya, whatever you want to call it. Like, I'm not trying to cherry pick it or straw man, but it just seems like he's giving that ontological foundation for it. Kind of like how Heidegger was trying to go back the inception of like being in the Greeks. It almost seems like Jameson's kind of showing like, see how it happened here, see how it happened in fairy tales, see how it happened in romance, just as a way to be like, this is its genesis, or it almost sounds teleological what you're saying before when you were talking about the diagnosis part. Like the inner aim of the political unconscious is to overcome material conditions. You can tell me if that seems off
Well,
base.
well, I mean, no, it's aligned, but like also just like to be able to kind of in the process develop the narrative, because with the whole thing about interpretation is also narrative. Um, because there is the narrative and even meta narrative is sort of dismantled by the French scene. I mean, for Leotard, right? What is it? Postmodernism is the incredulity of all meta narratives, but he thinks that's a good thing. And so for Fredric Jameson, he wants to restore that, because Marxism is not only a meta narrative, it is a worldview, but it's a worldview in which that it helps us frame all the multiplicities of different groups and struggles and cultures and texts, and how they somehow conglomerate into a sort of antagonism, which is class struggle. We don't start off with class struggle. We only end up arriving at it from our method. I won't say it's a ontological or a sort of development of an ontology, as it is more of a method and maybe like something epistemological.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if there is anything ontological, it's the fact that it is a materialism, um, which I would say, like, to the
I
comparison.
guess I mean more like the ground that allows the political unconscious to sort of
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
grow
yeah,
from, if that
yeah.
makes sense. But I agree with you that it's like he's doing it more like you're saying for the show why it's
Mhm.
important. The narrative and the literary perspective is showing the historicity and everything else. So I can see where like ontological makes it seem something different. So no, I
Yeah.
agree with you there too. Sorry
But
to
I
cut
would
you off.
I would say that the difference between him and Heidegger is that, well, Heidegger will go back into the past to talk about the meaning of being, and the sort of the etymology that he privileges Greece as having some sort of purity of getting at what is meant by being.
Yeah.
It's only through his sort of like romanticism of the Greeks, and also that like this um ideology that comes from German of like romanticizing the Greeks as being somewhat perfect, right?
And
Or
then Germans as well, which he was doing with the
uh-huh.
National Socialist Party and German
Mhm.
Dasein,
Mhm.
like
Uh,
evolving into it. So no, I
yeah.
agree there.
And so
Jameson's
it's
not
like,
doing anything like that.
yeah, and so it's not really dialectical and sort of historicizing it. It's more, it's like trying to um create a sort of genealogy, um to be
Mm-hmm.
Nietzschean, to describe like, oh, this is where things went wrong with these ideas or values, um and then let me sort of restore it in sort of pure form, because he's worried about this meaning of being that seems to
Mm-hmm.
get lost because of all modern philosophy went back to after that to in the scholastics, essence and existence, and then you get cogito, and then subject and object,
Yeah,
and that like,
early Heidegger.
mhm.
I guess for me, because like when we read last semester the elementary forms of religious life, and when Durkheim was talking about like the sacred faith, he was talking about how the sacred makes you be ethical, and it reminded me of Levinas, and how Levinas was taking Heidegger a little bit further. And I was trying to argue that even Durkheim, even though he was trying to explain how the primitive creates like the social that we have today, like civilization, that primitive doesn't mean bad. It's like the ontological foundation for it. So I guess for me, that's just what from like my lens that I've been looking at for a while. So it's like if I can have some philosophical purchase from like seeing the ontological foundations of a work or like a methodology, it helps me because then I'm like, okay, there's a foundation that allows this, and they're able to. But no, I don't think Jameson's like, oh, if we just get Aletheia will lead us to the Marxist vision that we all have class consciousness and everything will be better. We just need to go back to fucking Marx's epiphany moment or anything like that. I don't think he's doing that, but sorry for the digression. I thought it would be an interesting paper. I think it's an interesting conversation just to like
No, no, for
show
sure, for
some
sure.
of those foundations. And I think everybody when they're reading something has to have some. So I was reading this other book, trying to remember the name of it, but the guy's more Deleuzian. It's by Zero Books did it. I can't remember the name. Reading the Way of the Things by Daniel Cohen, I think is his name.
Hmm.
And he argues like he's like, I don't want any Freudian readings of things. I don't want Marxist. I don't want any. So I think I'm gonna pick that up when I finish this, just
Well,
after like
that's actually kind of funny that you say that, because that's like one of the criticisms that we're gonna get to like in a couple pages about the Deleuzian method, because one
yep,
of those things that I'm sure, like, I've never heard of the guy. I know about Zero Books, um, but like
some random English professor, I think.
right, and it's like there's this like sort of critique against like the referent or the center, deterritorializing, because the signifier is like despotic, and so meaning is not the thing we need in literature. That's why they have this term minor literature. But we'll get to that more, because he does talk about like the problems of a sort of Deleuzian reading. But I do like the juxtaposition though between the Heidegger and then Jameson, because it's like, one of the things that like you see in the history of 20th century French theory is that they are influenced heavily by Heidegger, Foucault, Derrida, uh, who else? D and G to some extent, although they're more
Because they're
influenced
from
by
Foucault.
Nietzsche. They're more influenced by Nietzsche, but of course Foucault is both influenced by Nietzsche and by Heidegger, um, and Lyotard, etc. This man.
Jameson brings them up quite a bit too, like
Yep.
later
Yeah.
on, like I was talking to you. But I think, like you're saying, he just takes it in a different. The guy's name was Daniel Kofi, and it
Mm.
literally says a Deleuzian McLuhan reading, and like his preface, he's like, "I'm tired of books where it's like you can't pick up being in, let's say, being in nothingness, like we were saying before, unless you understand it." And it's like, yeah, you can pick it up. You could pick up the political unconscious with having no clue who Marx is, read it, and still get something out of it. But that like Deleuzian reading of it, you're gonna be lost in the sauce, miss out on like the greater narrative that's going on and what his argument is going on. So it's like I feel like a lot of people who pick up that, because like I'll read like that sometimes, but 90% of the time it's me rationalizing just so I don't have to do as much work. Because like there are people who I've talked to who are like, I don't want to get into philosophy. I don't want to Plato or Aristotle. And I was like, Robert Sig has a quote like that, and he's like, if you don't try to philosophize, like they tell you need to read everything, you'll be 300 years old by the time you catch up. It's like 2,500 years of thought. It's like you could skip around and shit and come up with your own stuff, but it's like you need some foundation where you're not going to understand, or you need somebody who did do some of those readings. So I could ask like you or I could ask Daniel and like get a better Conrad, because people were talking about that in the group last time. They were like, I don't really understand literary references, so I'm having a harder time. And it's like the delusion appeals when I'm like lazy or I just want to be more creative. And like if I wanted to like free write after reading the political unconscious, maybe I'll get like some ideas and be inspired from it because the writing is really elegant. It's interesting, and you could just cherry pick quotes from this and get like a some idea of what's going on. But you're gonna miss out on, like you were telling me even before I brought it, like it's gonna make you want to read Althusser. And when I was reading Bordeaux, and he kept bringing up Althusser, I'm like, okay, I'll feel better philosophically or sociologically if I have some fucking idea of what Althusser is talking about. Like that 40-page digression on Althusser, I'm sure is extremely important, but it's like 80% of it went over my head. I didn't know what was going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Althusser and Lukács are like the main people that he's gonna reference a lot in this text. In fact, in a way where he tries to like conjoin the two together, which is usually like, like, wait, whoa, why would you want to do that? Because they're completely, from a superficial standpoint, diametrically opposed. One's anti-humanist and anti-Hegelian, which is Althusser, and the other one is a Hegelian and promotes. I don't think he explicitly says humanism, but like he adheres to alienation and
Is
reification,
he
which
is he
humanistic concept.
anti Heidegger too? Somebody was saying, unless I'm wrong
Yeah,
on
no,
my thought.
he definitely is against Heidegger, Schelling, Nietzsche. I mean, his Destruction of Reason book, which is like his later
I'm gonna
work,
read it.
is diagnosing philosophy after Kant with and all of like thought and politics with irrationalism, right? And this appeal to like romanticism, vitalism, and sort of spiritualism that seem innocent as at first, but this hermeneutics of suspicion shows that there's a sort of reactionary tendency that kind of evokes politically.
I need to read that at some point. So I feel like even if we do go on tangents, I feel like it's still important because of giving some foundation or a new
Yeah,
avenue.
yeah, absolutely.
Was I at from this perspective?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. From this perspective, the convenient working distinction between cultural texts that are social and political and those that are not becomes something worse than an error, namely a symptom and a reinforcement of the reification, privatization of contemporary life. Such a distinction reconfirms the structural, experiential, and conceptual gap between the public and the private, between the social and the psychological, or the political and the poetic, between history or society and the individual, which the tendential law of social life under capitalism maims our existence as individual subjects and paralyzes our thinking about time, excuse me, and change just as surely as it alienates us from our speech itself. To imagine that sheltered from the omnipresence of history, implacable influence of the social, there already exists a realm of freedom, whether it be that of the microscopic experience of words in a text or the ecstasies and intensities of various private religions, is only to strengthen the grip of necessity over all such blind zones, in which the individual subject seeks refuge in pursuit of a purely individual, a merely psychological project of salvation. The only effective liberation from such constraint begins with the recognition that there is nothing that is not social and historical, indeed, that everything is in the last. The assertion of the political unconscious proposes that we undertake just such a final analysis and explore the multiple paths that led to the unmasking of cultural artifacts and socially symbolic acts. It projects a rival hermeneutic to those already enumerated, but it does so, as we shall see, not so much by repudiating their findings as by arguing its ultimate philosophical and methodological prowess over more specialized interpretive codes whose insights are strategically limited as such by their own situational origins as by their narrow local ways in which the consumer constructs their objects instead. I don't know if that's where I was supposed to end or not.
Oh no, that's fine. Yeah, I can take it over right here. And so, I mean, I don't really have anything to add. I could just keep reading and stop at some point because I think we've been
Understood.
going on talking like once we get up to like past this scene, I think, or this page, I think there's going to be some good kernels of jams to be able
Okay.
to riff off. So he says right here,
Okay.
still to describe the readings and analysis contained in the present work as so many interpretations to present them as so many exhibits in the construction of a new hermeneutics is already to announce a whole polemic program, which must necessarily come to terms with the critical and theoretical climate, very, very hostile to these slogans. And as he says, because I was looking at that footnote, it's a footnote to so it's the footnote to is that five to Foucault's retreat and the return of origins. Oh, it's in the order of things, which is one of his famous texts where he kind of develops this sort of archaeology of knowledge and sort of like critique of the episteme. Um, again, this like genealogy of retracing like knowledge and practices and power back to like different like epoch to now, but that's a digression. Um,
No, I think it's important though,
yeah.
especially talking
Um,
about
I actually got it recently because one of my goals is like if Daniel, I made a joke to call him, but I was like, if Daniel has Nietzsche and you got Heidegger, then I guess I'm gonna get Foucault.
hell yeah, that'd be awesome.
uh, Jameson says it is, for instance, increasingly clear that hermeneutics of interpretive activity has become one of the basic polemic targets of contemporary post-structuralism in France, which powerfully buttresses by the authority of Nietzsche, has tended to identify such operations with historicism, and in particular with the dialectic and its valorization of absence and the negative, its assertion of the necessity and priority of the totalizing thought. I will agree with this identification, with this description of the ideological affinities and implications of the ideal of interpretive and hermeneutic act. But I will argue that the critique is misplaced. Indeed, one of the most dramatic of such recent attacks on interpretation, and he quotes or he references Anti-Oedipus by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, quite properly takes at its objection not Marxism, but rather Freudian interpretations, which is characterized as a reduction and a rewriting of the whole rich and random multiple realities of concrete everyday experience into the contained strategically pre-limited terms of the family narrative, whether this be seen in myth, Greek tragedy, family romance, or even the Lacanian structural version of the Oedipus complex. What is denounced is therefore a system of allegorical interpretations in which the data of a narrative line, of one narrative line, are radically impoverished by the rewriting according to the paradigm of another narrative, which is taken as the former's master code or narrative, and proposed as the ultimate hidden or unconscious meaning of the first one. The thrust of the argument of Anti-Oedipus is, to be sure, very much in spirit of the present work. For the concerns of its author is to reassert the specificity of political contents of everyday life and of individual fantasy experience, and to reclaim it from the reduction to the merely subjective and to the status of the psychological projection, which is even more characteristic of American culture and ideological life today than it is of a still politicized France. My point in mentioning this example is to observe that the repudiation of an older interpretive system, Freudian rewriting, over hastily assimilated to the hermeneutics in general, and as such is the Anti-Oedipus, coupled with the projection of a whole new method of the reading text. So he quotes right here. The unconscious poses no problem of meaning, slowly problems of use. The question poses by desire is not what does it mean, but rather how does it work. The unconscious represents nothing but it produces. It means nothing, but it works. Desire makes its entry with the general collapse of the question. What does it mean? No other has no one other, or sorry, no one has been able to pose the problem of a language except to the extent that linguists and logicians have first eliminated meaning. And the greatest force of language was only discovered once a work was viewed as a machine, producing certain effects amenable to a certain use. Malcolm Lowry says of his work, it's anything you want it to be, so long as it works. It works too, believe me, as I have found out machinery. But on condition that the meaning be another than use, it becomes a firm principle only if we have at our disposal imminent criteria capable of determining the legitimate use as opposed to the illegitimate ones that relate to use instead of the hypothetical meaning and reestablish a kind of transcendence. So like I think from like what he's getting is like, you know, there's something about anti-Oedipus where at once like I do agree with understanding the way in which like, and again their reading interpretation is both like a criticism of Freud, a psychoanalysis, and Lacan, but actually also trying to use the Freudian understanding of like reinscription of the unconscious, right? Um, like being able to realize like with the origin of the unconscious of the Oedipal dynamic is at once also a reinscription, but their understanding of desire um, is that like to them it's lack, and so because it has to do with the signifier, that the signifier also contains certain meaning, and they think this meaning is sort of totalitarian or despotic because of the fact that it has to do with, well, one, not this like family dynamic that psychoanalysis would describe as an Oedipus complex, or that like when you look at different myths, that it slowly like goes back to the fact that the Oedipus complex or just the Oedipal drama is the myth of humanity, but rather that we are made of a multiplicity of codes that don't relate to meaning but are just productive forces. They're machinic because they just work and produce, and that in their discovery, desire is productive and anti-productive, and it's because of the capitalist code in the state creates lack and ascribes a productive lack onto them. And so the point is that we need to focus on a desire that produces so we can get away from meaning. But this is not exactly what Jameson wants to subscribe to, because he wants to talk about a dialectic that is on a movement of not only negation of the negation, but a movement in which we can discover a movement of a narrative, not to get rid of narrative and only focus on the multiplicity of just work and desire as production, imminent, and always escaping a regime of meaning.
I
Because
think
the problem with D&G is that like they move away from the Marxist method, and um, they focus on like the way that uh, groups and not even group subjects, but just groups in general become like the sort of multiplicity of different like ways to decenter and create new cultures. And it's not about a sort of totality of like class struggle.
I was just gonna say that I think I know more um, A Thousand Plateaus than Anti-Oedipus, because I was talking to Mikey about it during the Latin course. I'm trying to like compare some of it with what Robert Pirsig says about like dynamic aesthetic quality, and from how I was explaining it to Mikey, he was telling me that's more like A Thousand Plateaus. So I was reading the reader's guide and some of it, and he doesn't say it here, but I think part of the problem too, or maybe it's just how I like put D and G in a box, is it's like I agree that it's important to have like new lines of flight, creativity, breaking away from desiring capitalist machine on would call like the auto exploitation, where you like get burnout and things about nature, just take it in a different direction. But it at the same time, like that reading the way of things book, if you do that and you make it like anything can be anything, Wittgenstein's like beetle in a box, you're not going to be able to have any like either existential like authentic meaning for everybody, in the sense where it's like you take Martin Luther King's civil rights movement, or it's the Kierkegaardian leap of faith, like unconditional commitment. I'm going to do everything I can to like improve things. So it could be the Jameson Marxist utopia. you can't have that if everybody's just kind of like, I'm doing my own thing, I'm just being creative, or I'm manifesting what I want. And I think that's how you end up with like the meaning crisis that we're in and other aspects where it's like, okay, you throw out work and desire and other things. That's good, but at the same time, you're gonna have like the Nietzschean death of God, where it's anything could be anything. I don't know. Why do I get out of the bed? And you're gonna have like Heideggerian angst. No, I'm like using all these terms really, but I think that's
Yeah,
part of the problem. That's all I was gonna say.
yeah, for sure. No, 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 yeah, definitely. I'll just read this last page
Okay.
before I hand it over to you. From our present standpoint, however, the ideal of an imminent analysis of the text, of dismantling or deconstruction of its parts, and a description of its functioning and malfunctioning amounts less to a whole nullification of the interpretive activity than to a demand for the construction of some new and more adequate, imminent, and anti anti-transcendent hermeneutic model, which it will be the task of the following pages to propose. The Nietzschean and anti-interpretive current is, however, not without its equivalent in a certain contemporary Marxism. The enterprise of constructing a properly Marxist hermeneutic must necessarily confront the powerful objections to a traditional models of interpretation raised by the influential school of the so-called structural or Althusserian Marxism. Althusser's own position on the subject is spelled out in his theory of the three historical forms of causality or effectivity in a document so significant for contemporary theory that it is worth quoting at some time or some length. The epistemological problem posed by Marx's radical modification of political economy, can be expressed as follows. By means of what concept is it possible to think the new type of determination, which has just been identified as determination of the phenomenon of a given region by the structure of that region? In other words, how is it possible to define the concept of a structural causality? Very schematically, we can say that classical philosophy had only two systems of concepts within which to think effectivity or causality. The mechanistic system, which is Cartesian in origin, which can reduce causality to a transitive and analytical effectivity, could not be made to think the effectivity of a whole on its elements except at the cost of extra ordinary distortions such as those in Descartes' psychology and biology. But a second system was available, one conceived precisely in order to deal with the effectivity of a whole on its elements, the Leibnizian conception of expression. This is the model that dominates all Hegel's thought, but it presupposes in principle that the whole in question be reducible to an inner essence, of which the elements of the whole are then no more than the phenomenal forms of expression, the inner principle of the essence being present at each point in the whole, such that at each moment it is possible to write the immediately adequate equation. Such and such an element, economic, political, legal, literary, religious, etc., in Hegel, equal the inner essence of the whole. Here was a model which made it possible to think the effectivity of the whole on each of its elements. But if this category, inner essence, outer phenomenon, was to be applicable everywhere and in every moment to each of the phenomenon arising in the totality in question, it presupposes that the whole had a certain nature, precisely the nature of a spiritual whole, in which each element was expressive of the entire totality as a pars totalis. In other words, Leibniz and Hegel did have a category for the effectivity of the whole, on which elements or parts, but the absolute condition that the whole was not a structure. The third concept of effectivity, that of structural causality, can be entirely summed up in the concept of Darstellung, the key epistemological concept of the whole Marxist theory of value, the concept whose object is precisely to designate the mode of presence of the structure and its effects, and therefore to designate structural causality itself. The structure is not an essence outside the economic phenomenon, which comes in their aspect, forms and relations, in which is effective only then as an absent cause, absent because it is outside them. The absence of the cause of the inner structure is metonymic causality. On its effect is not the fault of the exteriority of the structure with respect to the economic phenomenon. On the contrary, it is the very form of the interiority of the structure as a structure in its effect. This implies, therefore, that the effects are not outside the structure, are not a pre-existing object, element, or space in which the structure arrives to imprint its mark. On the contrary, it implies that the structure is immanent in its effects, because immanent in its effects in the Spinoza's sense of the term of that term, that the whole existence of the structure consists in its effects. In short, that the structure, which is merely a specific combination of peculiar elements, is nothing outside of its effects. So it seems like for this structural causality, it's, as he says, it's nothing outside of its effects, that it manifests, the structure manifests in its effects, but the cause is always absent, and that seems to become a problem. And it's like for effect in the expressive mode, it's like every particular thing is sort of the manifestation of like an expressive inner essence, right? And in Hegel, it's like the movement of like the in itself for itself, maybe, or the what is it, the the universal is already contained within its particular, should be more accurate, versus the mechanistic thing of just like in one end, if you look at Newtonian physics, it's the classical billiard ball thing, but then there's a concept of mechanistic causality and Descartes as well when it comes to sort of like the A's to B's to C formula, which is kind of more of a generalization. I'm not sure if Descartes actually says it like that, but in his notions of like, the difference between cogito and res extensia, there's a sort of material mechanistic terminus motion. It's like first comes this, then comes that, right? We have a presence of an actual mechanistic cause to have a visible mechanistic effect. For Hegel and Leibniz and their expressive causality, it's like the cause is inherent within the expression, as an essence, and the potentiality is the sort of cause for the monad's infinite possibility, right? And then for Hegel, it's this movement of particular and universal, Geist realizing itself in its particular, and then like for Althusser, it's like something totally different. It's like, oh no, it's not an inner essence. It's not sort of some ontology. It's pure effect of structure, right? But we never see the structure outside of the effect, right?
How would you, if someone came up to you and they were like, "Hey, I'd never read any philosophy before. I don't know who Hegel is. I don't know who Plato is," and was reading this, like, what? Because this is a very long passage,
Mm-hmm.
and then a very long. At some point, I know he says, may even be in the footnote. He's like, "Hey, if this is not your thing, skip to page 58." Like he tells the reader. I didn't do that, but what would? How would you explain to somebody the purpose of this long quote, or just the that not digression, but why he brings up Althusser and the absent cause? Because I feel like I'm still like when you were explaining that just now, it kind of like the wheels were spinning, but I still feel like I don't have. That's why I want to read Althusser because I feel like I don't have that foundation for it.
Yeah, well, so like, for mechanistic cause, like, that could explain certain things, especially like when we're dealing with like purely empirical things, like, especially like engineering, we always go about like the mechanistic cause, like, oh, like the lack of fuel is the
No,
reason
I get that. I
the
guess what
car
I'm
won't
trying to
start.
say is what's
Uh
the what's the purpose of like going from like, hey, we're going to talk about narrative of what the political unconscious is to now I'm talking about like desire and causality. How would you like break that down?
Right. And so the whole point, right, why he makes the shift is because it has to do with causality and its effect. Um and why that matters for the political unconscious and why he's so adamant about it right here is that, well, there's something to this notion of absent cause because I mean, in the Lacanian sense, the absent cause is the subject, right? The subject is never present as a cause, but only kind of reveals itself as like the effect, but it's never outside the effect. Um, and so we could see this, and so this is why he's like talking about this because there's this sort of dilemma or tension between expressive causality and structural causality, and he doesn't want to get rid of either or, um, because the problem would be then like the effects of not only the problem of, of narrative and the ideology and culture, but also um, the potential in which we could overcome that, right? Um, and I think if I understand correctly, it's like to think about political unconscious, to think about a narrative that isn't revealed in representation, but revealed in some sort of symbolic inscription. It can't be just reduced down to cause, but it can't be also reduced down to the side of expressive causality as, like, oh, the class consciousness is inherent within the proletariat or within the working class. Like the revolution is inherent with that. Um, Nor is it like we're trapped in this enclosed thing where it's like no matter what, we're always at the whims of this sort of purely contingent effects where like the cause is never there. It's never present. It's always absent. So we can never have necessity. So it's like I think this dialectic between necessity and contingency that he kind of wants to re-evoke with these two notions of expressive causality and freaking structural causality to overcome the crude Marxism or the crude Hegelianism. It's hidden. The flower is hidden in the seed, right? It's the essence in the of the seed, like hold or like the seed holds the essence of the flower, right? Or the tree, right?
No, that was a really good. I threw like a PhD level fucking thesis question at you. It was like, hey, explain this in like 30 seconds for an idiot. So that was really well done. First off, and then
I mean, like, yeah, like when I first read this too, like, it was hard to understand. I know, like, Tut's little diagram that he made his PowerPoint was very helpful, but I think like when you read it again, you kind of understand, like, okay, especially when he talks about like the inner expression, right? Because in some sense there is an expression of, like, for instance, to go back to capitalism, there is a sort of inner expression of a logic of a value form of the commodity, right? But it manifests and generates and transforms over time. But then also the structural causality manifests within its effects, which are the class struggle, right? But they always sort of, I think, like what he's trying to get at, and again, this is the sort of concept that he'll develop later in another work called the vanishing mediator, where it's like the vanishing mediator would be the class struggle. It's like, why is this antagonism happening? Why is the economic crisis happening? Why is it that there's a war going on or a genocide? Well, the vanishing mediator is capitalistic, but we can't see it in like sort of inner essence. But it's not to say it's without like this sort of like internal tension, not like essences in like, you know, the classical scholastic sense, but like an essential tension, an embedded logic, which it moves, and it is also at the same time the subject of it is also absent, right? And I think that like in that sense, it's like the contradiction be like the bourgeois uh ideology and also like its own negation, which is sort of proletarianization.
I think that's really good. I was asking too because even Bordeaux brings up games. He's trying to talk about how your like socialized habit is. You want to play a game, and you start like talking about the rules sometimes, or you violate it. It's when people start thinking about like how absurd it is that you're playing into it and society's a game. And then he takes that and goes into causality, and then it's trying to explain. He's like, kind of what we were talking about last time, or existentialism one where I was like, you only have to shit or die. Because he's like saying, he's like, you don't want to buy into the capitalist system, the game of it, you could like literally just not eat and then like die or be homeless or whatever and say fuck it. So I feel like the question of the telos of it or causality is important. And he brings up Althusser as well, like shortly after, because I know he's big on ideology as well. I have that For Marx book coming. I think it's out of print. It's really hard to get. I had to go through thrift books for it. Hopefully, it comes in one piece. But anyway,
Oh, really? I
yeah,
didn't realize that.
yeah.
Because
What I had,
it's published by Verso, so it's like
they said 10 to 12 days, so I think they have to like print it
interesting.
possibly, and Amazon like can print quicker, but they don't have it. So I just did thrift book. Barnes and Noble had it too, but a lot of places are like 10 to 12. So maybe it's in Europe. I don't know, but Blackwell's had it too. So I don't know. But anyway, I digress. I just brought it up because I think they're like I'm saying, they're on two separate tracks, like parallel lines, but they go in different directions. And it's just interesting because they're both tearing with Althusser, they're tearing with Hegel, Marxism. They have two completely different end goals. And the first time I read this passage, I was so fucking confused. That's why I made that meme of the breathwork guy, because it like felt like I was fighting for my fucking life, and it made a lot more sense. Like I understood a little bit more as like you were explaining it, even when you were reading it. But it's I was just like, if the off chance you get somebody watching this never encountered it, I think that explanation would be really helpful. And then I just wanted to ask you if you're cool with wrapping it up shortly. I have to focus
Yeah, I would
a
say
little
let's
bit.
let's finish the your last your 2 pages and we could just end it.
Okay, sounds good. Also, there's first type of ethic fitting that of sorry, I can't speak now, or mechanical causality, exemplified in the Billard-Ball model, cause and effect, has long been a familiar exhibit in the history of ideas, and in particular in the history of science, where it is associated with the Galilean and Newtonian worldview, and it is assumed to have been outmoded by the indeterminacy principle of modern physics. This type of causality is general. I was going to tell too anybody watching this, don't talk to Andrew. He'll make you buy like 37 different books. So take that as you will. The type of causality is
It's
generally
true.
where you got to get like an Amazon link. It's like one of the partner ones, so you get like 10%. I probably would have bought your beer this weekend at this point. The type of causality is generally the target of the loose contemporary consensus on the outmoded character of the category of causality as such. Yet even this type of causal analysis is by no means everywhere discredited in cultural studies today. Its continuing influence may be observed, for instance, in that technological determinism, which McLuhanism remains the most interesting contemporary expression, but also of which certain more properly Marxist studies, like Walter Benjamin's ambiguous vote for the air, are also variants. Indeed, the Marxist tradition includes models which have so often been denounced as mechanical or mechanistic, most notably the familiar and notorious concept of base, infrastructure, and superstructure, for to have no small stake in the re-examination of this type of causality. I would want to argue that the category of mechanical effectivity retains a purely local validity in cultural analysis, where it can be shown that Billard ball causality remains one of the non-synchronous laws of our particular fallen social reality. It does little good, in other words, to banish extrinsic categories from our thinking when the latter continue to have a hold of the objective realities about which we claim to think. There seems, for instance, to have been an unquestionable causal relationship between the admittedly extrinsic fact of the crisis in late 19th century publishing, during which the dominant three-decker lending library novel was replaced by a cheaper one-volume form, and the modification of the inner form of the novel. The resultant transformation of the novelistic production of writers such as Ginseng, I don't know if I read that correctly, must thus necessarily be mystified, by attempts of literary scholars to interpret the new form in terms of personal evolution or of the internal dynamics of purely formal change. That a material and contingent accident should leave its traces of formal breaking points. Modifications of Gising's narrative categories, as well as the very structure feeling of his novel. There's no doubt a scandalous assertion. Yet what is scandalous is not this way of thinking about a given formal change, but rather the objective event itself. The very nature of cultural change in a world in which separation of use value from exchange value generates discontinuities of precisely the scandalous and extrinsic rifts and actions at distance, which cannot ultimately be grasped from inside or phenomenologically, but which must be reconstrued as symptoms whose cause is another order of phenomenon effects. Mechanical causality is thus less a concept which might be evaluated on its own terms than one of these various laws and subsystems of our peculiar, reified social and cultural life. Nor is it occasional experience without benefit to the cultural critic, for whom the scandal of the extrinsic comes as a salutary reminder of the ultimately material base of cultural production and of the determination of conscience by social beings. It must therefore be objected that Althusser's ideological analysis concept of mechanical causality, that this unsatisfactory category is not merely a form of false consciousness or error, but also a system of objective contradictions that are still with us. That said, it is also clear that as the second form of capacity, Althusser enumerates so-called expressive causality, which is the polemic part of his argument, as well as the more vital issue and burning temptation in cultural criticism today. The counter slogan of totalization can be the immediate response to Althusser's critique of expressive causality, if for no other reason than the totalization of itself numbered among the approaches stigmatized by this term, which range from the various concepts of the worldviews or period styles of the giving historical moment, Kant, Hegel, Spengler, Gold, all the way to contemporary structural or post-structural efforts at modeling the dominant Epstein or sign system of this or that historical period, as in Foucault, Deleuze-Guattari, Gary Lotman, or the theorists of consumer society, most notably Jean Baudrillard. I'll just finish the paragraph. Such a catalog suggests not that Althusser's critique may be construed much more widely than the work of Hegel, which is in its central exhibit and may find application in thinkers who are expressly non or anti-Hegelian, but also that what is at stake here would seem significantly related to problems of cultural periodization in general and to that of the category of historical period in particular. However, the most properly Marxist models of expressive causality denounced by Althusser are structured from a rather different perspective as involving the practice of mediation and as dramatized as still relatively idealistic concepts of both individual and collective practice. We'll return to these two approaches later in the presentation. I'm just gonna say real quick, the meme of the baby who like they have like the phone and it's like a YouTube video. It's just gonna be me like making them read Marxist and Althusser
Yeah.
shit. So like by the time they're older, they can fucking understand the
Yeah.
political unconscious and other shit.
Hmm.
There's a lot. Like gotta put them on it.
You gotta put them at it. Yeah. When I think of like the criticism of expressive causality, it's like I think of like that meme of like you got like the it's like the grandpa, then like
Yeah,
the son who's like a dad, and then he's got like his and then the son's got the baby, and they're all like bottle
yeah,
feeding each other. It's
yeah.
like that's like expressive causality, right?
That's a good way. You should make that. That'd be hilarious. But no.
Yeah. God damn. We got up to 27 pages.
No, that was good. And I feel like I
Yeah.
went on a few tangents too.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, but it does help because when I read this shit in the car on the way to get food, like some of it stuck with me, but it's like if somebody asked me to explain what was going on, I had no way to like orient myself. And I think
Yeah.
it's just important to do this. And like you were joking before about like me doing Heidegger, uh, Tut doing Althusser and Lukács, and like you doing like
Yeah.
Lacan and Foucault. It's like honestly, it does help that way, and that's the problem with capitalism in general. Like not the like Dave's time energy. It's like you only have so much money, you
Yeah.
only have so much like time, and then you only have so much everything else. So it's like you have to divest. Some people need to research this and then have content.
Yeah, no, for real. Hmm.
it's just hard to keep those like communities together sometimes because everybody's got like a million different interpretations
Oh,
to things.
oh yeah.
But with intellectual matters, I feel like sometimes ego like comes in and
Oh yeah,
a whole lot of
absolutely.
that.
But I think like
This
one thing I like about this text is like it's just like yeah, I'm familiar with a lot of these thinkers that he's bringing up. Like I've read them before, but it's just like the argumentative style, the writing is just so difficult. Like
Yeah, no,
you
it
know,
really is. This is up there, like when Daniel was saying like difficulty of like the preface of phenomenology and spirit. I'm like, he's not fucking kidding. And then Nick was telling me, he's like, Jameson's like my main guy right now. All right, wait, that's
yeah.
like me like struggling to try to like squat without any weight, and this motherfucker is like got
Five.
what's the
It's like
what
Ronnie Coleman.
yeah, have you seen that meme where it's like, what's more difficult? It's like benching 225, deadlifting 4 plates, squatting like six or something. And then it would be like reading the political unconscious.
Yeah.
I should make
Well,
one.
yeah. I know Nick started off with the one.
Yeah,
So
he was telling me
going
this one was hard.
back, yeah, I know it's definitely a lot harder. Yeah. Well, for all those who stood till the end, thank you for bearing our struggle and watching us struggle with this text. This shit ain't easy. Right?
That was good, man. Just let me
Yeah,
know
you need that. That.
if you want to do it again sometime.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. Let me end this recording, y'all. Come back next time. Peace.